The first time I saw the Alamein line on a wartime map, it looked deceptively simple, a straight stitch between the Mediterranean and a gray blank named the Qattara Depression. On the ground, that stitch became a corridor of fate. Sea to the north, a salt and quicksand wilderness to the south, and in between a strip of hard desert where armies could not sidestep each other. Here, tanks were not just weapons. They were grammar and punctuation, the way sentences of battle were formed and finished. When veterans later called the desert the home turf of armor, I understood what they meant as soon as I stepped into that corridor. Everything conspires to let steel move and see the horizons are wide, the vegetation negligible, and the villages so few that names cling to ridges and wells like fragile labels. But nothing in North Africa grants gifts without a price. El Alamein taught both halves of that lesson, with a clarity I still feel in my teeth. I walk with the diaries. On one side lie the notes of Panzer Army Africa, entries terse as wire shortages tallied, bearings failing, sand sieving into the lungs of carburetors, then sudden, almost cheerful lines when open country allowed a sweep of maneuver. On the other side, 8th Army's papers grow more patient as 1942 wears on, their caution resolving into a plan that treats the desert not as a canvas for cavalry romance, but as a geometry problem that can be solved with enough tape, mines, and artillery. The first battle at Alamein in July stopped the Axis like a hand on a chest, but it did not push them back. That would wait for October, for a general who liked clocks and a doctrine that turned sand into a partner rather than an enemy. Why is the desert a home turf for tanks? I can answer by pointing to the spaciousness. In the desert, a platoon commander looks through a gun sight and sees 2 kilometers of truth. No hedgerows to ambush him, no forests to shear formations into panic, no city blocks to swallow a squadron whole. He can choose angles, trade distance for time, and fight at the range where his gun writes the verdict. A good crew can turn visibility into survival. When I lay the gunnery tables beside those aerial photographs, the math kisses the landscape in a way Normandy never permitted. Sightlines are generous, and so the reticle becomes a king. But the same spaciousness invites traps. The British learned it at Gazala, the Germans at Alam Halfa, and both relearned it here. What the desert grants in maneuver, it steals in concealment and firmness. Hard ground can become a dust bowl by afternoon, and dust is an insurgent that fights for whoever needs confusion. The best tank in the wrong sand sinks its courage up to the belly. The most elegant plan dies at the lip of a mine belt if sappers have not quarried lanes through. When I read the appendices to Operation Lightfoot, the British plan for the second battle, I see page after page devoted not to dashing thrusts, but to the clearing of paths under strict timings, to the discipline of lifting mines by the thousand while artillery smothers the enemy's eyes. That is the desert's bargain. The open world will be yours, but only if you teach your army patience until your impatience can be decisive. The Alamein corridor itself dictates behavior. The Qattara Depression is not a scenic backdrop, but a wall. For tanks, it is a statement: here you fight, here you cannot pass. Rommel could not outflank south. Montgomery could not fear a southern hook. So they wrestled in a strip where every kilometer mattered and every track mark told. I carry with me an aerial print taken at dawn in late October 1942, and it shows the mine belts like pale scars, the so-called Devil's Gardens. Beyond those belts, dotted like punctuation, are the Axis anti-tank positions, each gun an angle waiting to be enforced. Tanks are at home in such a desert only when their friends are many infantry to cut lanes, engineers to mark them, guns to drown enemy guns, and a supply system that can drag petrol cans over horizons that do not forgive. A tank alone here is a boast waiting to be corrected. The first hours of the October offensive were a performance of belief. The night before, 8th Army stood in a line that glittered with bayonets under blackout hoods. Every brigade rehearsed as if the desert could be made to keep time. At 21:40, the guns began. Hundreds of them. Not quite a Western Front barrage, but close enough in sound to make old veterans swallow hard. The plan called it Lightfoot because the infantry would go first, stepping lightly through the minefields while the heavy vehicles waited, and then, by dawn, the corridors would be cut wide enough for armor to pour through. There is nothing airy about this lightness. A mine lifted is time bought. A white tape laid is a promise to steel that it may move with confidence for at least the length of a breath. I have spoken with sappers who still flinch at the memory of fuse caps and midnight, who learned that the desert's truest darkness lives under the surface. Rommel was absent with illness at the outset, and his temporary replacements did what professionals do. They read the ground and applied their doctrine. Counter battery, harassing fire. Local counterattacks by Kampfgruppen shaped like quick hands. The Axis at Alamein knew how to use the desert's long lines of fire better than anyone in 1941. By late 1942, the British had learned to make those lines unsafe with weight and method. Tanks in the night threaded forward as infantry burned gaps. Escorts to gunners more than hunter-killers. I have a squadron leader's report that reads like a slow heartbeat moved 300 yards. Halted for tape, moved 400 yards. Halted for lifting party. Engage flicker at 800 yards. Probable gun. That is the desert without romance. And it is the way victories are grown here. When dawn broke, the first real armored duels of the October battle began. They were not the reckless sprints that earlier months had celebrated. They were patient trades of shell and position across flats and low ridges, with every troop leader mindful of what the mines and the artillery behind him had just bought. In this light, the desert's home turf quality revealed itself in full. Guns spoke at ranges that would have been impossible in the Bocage, and good crews carved advantages item by item, sun angle, dust drift, the honest hard pan versus the deceptive soft patches where a pivot turn could betray a track. I stood years later on Kidney Ridge and tried to see what those gunners saw. The land is a subtle plain, hardly a rise, but enough to hide a hull and show a turret. A turret is a story a desert gunner can read at 2,000 meters. Logistics whispered its iron law over every decision: petrol, water, ammunition, spares, filters. In the desert, the line of supply is a second front that cannot be outflanked, only shortened by victory. War diaries still carry the bruises of those numbers. A battalion reports its fighting-fit tanks on a neat line, and beside it the things that might keep more tanks fighting track pins. Road wheels, air filters, fan belts, and always fuel. Tanks are desert creatures by aptitude, but they are domesticated animals by sustenance. At Alamein, the British, for once, had the pantry stocked and the road marked. That alone did not win the battle, but without it, nothing else would have mattered. What struck me most, reading the after-action reports from both sides, was how quickly the desert turned bravery into craft. A green crew arrived with romantic expectations. A week later, its language hardened into angles and timings. Newcomers asked to charge. Veterans asked for lanes and flanking dust. The Germans had come by this education earlier, in the mobile wars that made Rommel famous, where space looked infinite and the trick was to arrive where the enemy did not expect a fist. By El Alamein in October, that infinity had been fenced with mines and guns, and the British had become the headmasters of the fence. Tanks were still at home in this open world, but they were living in a house with rules. You could win here by combining patience and violence in exact proportions. You could die by getting the ratio wrong. At night, the desert's generosity turned inside out. Visibility collapsed to flare-lit islands, and navigation devolved to compass and nerve. Yet even then, tanks belonged. Their engines were heat and mobility in a land that punished stillness. I have a captain's account of a night advance where the compass was king and the white tapes were rosary. The unit advanced not by romance, but by ritual 50 yards. Halt. Listen. 50 more. Halt. Check. The desert is not a place for impatience after dark. It is a place where a tank's heartbeat, regulated by discipline, ensures men see sunrise. The records leave little doubt about what the desert loves and what it hates. It loves robustness, clear sight, and commanders who trust their sappers. It hates overconfidence, especially the kind that treats sand like a parade ground. El Alamein is where those truths became doctrine. I think of it as a school built on rock and salt, with a bell that rings by artillery in a curriculum of lanes, arcs, and fuel. The classrooms were marked with mine signs and tape, and the final exam took 12 days. By the second night, I could feel the plan tightening like a tourniquet. The first day's break-in had opened the mine belts in places, but not enough for armor to flood. Where I had hoped to read elegant arrows across the sand, I found instead a lacework of corridors, each marked by white tape and courage, with traffic jams of steel nosing forward like cattle through gates. The diaries show how stubborn the desert can be when you try to hurry it. A brigade inching at 3 miles per hour becomes a target. A tank halted for a sapper team's last-minute probe becomes a sermon on patience. In my notes, I underlined the same phrase from 2 sides, no shortcuts. That is a hard sentence to swallow in a war that loves glamour. The guns never stopped. You can trace their persistence in the clipped lines of artillery logs, defensive fire here, concentrations there, counter battery dragging its slow net across suspected pits. A British battery commander wrote that his map smelled of cordite and tea. A German officer answered, in his own hand, that his men had learned to time movements between British lifts the way children time sprints between waves. Somewhere beyond these professional exchanges, the Air Force leaned on the field like weather. The Desert Air Force flew so many sorties that the word Overwatch developed a weight I don't often see in archives. Axis gunners wrote of being worked by aircraft in smoke until their arcs were theories rather than guarantees. Tanks love a sky that keeps the other fellows' heads down. At Alamein in October, the sky chose sides more often than not. There is a page I carry from a New Zealand infantry officer who went up against Materia Ridge. He lists mine types the way a botanist lists thorns, then records a lane cleared and lost and cleared again as machine guns and mortars stitch the night into a painful fabric. Behind him, British armor waited with engines muttering, big animals leashed. One troop eased forward too soon and paid. Another waited too long and paid. It's not a paradox, merely desert mathematics. When the ridge finally gave in patches, the tanks surged to take the gift and ran headlong into anti-tank knots that had kept their fire all night like a miser keeps coins. The ridge was not a wall, it was a sentence with clauses, and each clause fought back. Up in the north, the Australians worried the coastal flank like terriers. Their assaults toward Tel El Asa and the coast road functioned as both prybar and distraction, designed to nibble at positions and to make the Axis spend reserves with bad grace. Reports from Panzer Army Africa complain of being pulled north by these sharp bites, even as the main British pressure kept renewing in the center and south. I watched the seesaw in documents like a heartbeat, reserves up, counterattack, reserves bloodied, lines stiffened, another British shove, a reshuffle. Tanks are at home in wide spaces. But at Alamein, the corridor and the choreography of infantry made them dance on marks set by artillery and mine plows. On the 24th, Acting Commander Georg Stuma died suddenly at the front. The note in the war diary is stark, a human rupture in a book of steel. Command passed, and within hours the familiar hand returned Rommel, recalled from illness, bringing with him the instinct to counterpunch. He recognized what the ground allowed and what it forbade. He probed where the British seemed tired, slapped where a corridor looked tender, and husbanded his strength where the mine belts and gun lines still promised economies. I don't glorify him. I record his fluency in this language of sand. Opposite him, Montgomery refused impatience. He measured each push by the minute sappers could buy and the tons per day the supply columns could deliver. Between these two tempers, the desert found its most articulate voice. Armored duels began to multiply in daylight on the flats behind the belts. They were not cavalry charges. They looked more like carpentry with explosives measured cuts, careful angles, a willingness to back off a bad joint and try from another side. A troop would take a hull-down scrape and barter shells for position. Another would throw dust to blind a gun while its mates edged to a flank. I stood on Kidney Ridge years later and watched a lizard run the shade line of a stone. Even that taught me something about how small rises matter out there. A tank commander who could read that modest topography owned seconds, and seconds own verdicts in places where ranges can stretch honest and long. The Italians, often dismissed by lazy memory, kept showing up in the wrong places for that stereotype to survive. At Folgore's positions in the south, diaries left by British units resort to adjectives they usually reserve for their own stubborn, skillful, imperturbable under shell fire. Anti-tank gunners with little glamour held lanes shut while German armor tried to parry the British Armored Division's probes. The desert is a snob in one way: only it respects performance and will hear no argument from flags. A 47mm that holds its nerve under a sky full of metal is more decisive than a memoir. Supply, all the while, dictated the conversation. Axis entries begin to show a fraying rope fuel delivered in thimbles compared to need. Convoys harassed by aircraft in the Royal Navy far to the west. Tires and tracks surrendering to an environment that eats rubber and patience together. British records, for once, speak in the smugness of full tins. Ammunition allotments met. Water rationed, but sufficient. Recovery and repair functioning like a second heartbeat behind the first. Tanks are desert princes only when their quartermasters remain uninsulted by distance. At Alamein, that insult fell mostly on one side. The closer I read, the more the desert's supposed simplicity dissolves into its thousand small complexities. A sun at the wrong angle can reveal a glint that betrays a truth. A wind that shifts by a few degrees can carry dust like a drawn curtain and hide an advance that would otherwise be suicide. Good commanders in the desert plant their attention in such details. They teach their brigades to think in mils and minutes, to love the tape that means a lane is real, to distrust ridges that look gentle because they can loan silhouettes to enemy gunners. You can feel the education happening day by day across the 12-day exam. The British, humiliated in earlier months by sweeping German maneuvers, now insisted on their own tempo, enforced by artillery and mines. The Germans, exquisitely schooled in movement, had to fight a static math with fewer numbers. By the 26th, the British attacks that had felt like a drum roll now sounded like variations on a theme fix. Feel, widen, test. When a corridor proved honest, armor went forward like a tide. When it turned dishonest, the tide drew back without shame and chose another beach. Rommel's counterstrokes never lost the capacity to cut several times. They bit so hard that British brigades rode thin, but he had to spend dear coin for every correction. He was fighting the desert's new headmaster as much as he was fighting men. The mine belts, once an Axis boast, now smothered Axis mobility, while British sappers and tank dozers wore grooves through their own obstacles until what had been garden became road. Even in this disciplined war, the sudden and savage remained. A squadron rounded a low escarpment and found itself nose to gun shield with an anti-tank line that had stayed dumb all morning. 3 turrets bloomed before the troop leader could finish his warning. A lone panzer commander, masked by dust, walked his rounds across British hulls at a range that would have shocked a school solution, only to be solved himself by a gun he didn't see because its crew had learned to be soil. These vignettes dazzle and tempt, and in bad hands they become the whole story. Set correctly, they are sparks that show you where the grain lies in the wood. Night kept stealing order and giving it back. Advances halted for tape. Flares invented new moons. Compasses and speedometers argued, and sergeants refereed. Recovery crawled, literally, under the war, dragging back what could be made to breathe and stripping what could not. A single fan belt stolen from a dead hull might grant another brigade an extra mile tomorrow. A salvaged periscope might extend a gunner's world by one more shot width. I learned to love the word serviceable in these inventories the way a thirsty man loves a clean canteen. Somewhere in the middle days, a feeling entered the documents that I have learned to recognize the enemy is not infinite, and the plan is not a prayer. The British built on that feeling, thickening pressure rather than seeking an instant dramatic tear. The Axis ran reconnaissance like men asking the desert where it hurt least and being told, again and again, nowhere cheap. Tanks were home in this fight because the arena let them be seen and see. The winners would be whoever could make seeing punish rather than promise. The mine belts and the gunnery schools were making sure of that. I turn the last page of that mid-battle file and find the order that announces resolve without trumpets, shift weight north. Keep the Australians gnawing. Prepare the armor for a blow named with immodest confidence, supercharge. No one on the ground heard fanfare in that name. They heard timings in minutes, corridors in yards, the old grammar of tape and white stones, and a horizon that had to be taught to cooperate. The desert was ready to yield to violence again, but only to violence escorted by method. We named it with the bravado of electricity. But inside the files, the order for supercharge reads like a carpenter's plan. Shift weight to the north. Draw a new seam west of Kidney Ridge. Give the infantry one more midnight through the Devil's Gardens. And at first light, send armor at the anti-tank crust until the crust breaks. The map fixes the axis of advance around Tel El Akakir, a name the wind pronounces better than any staff officer. Freyberg's New Zealanders were to hold the doorposts, British brigades to chisel the lintel, and a single armored brigade to be the ram. When I pause over that last sentence, I can hear the engines already idling in the dark, and I can feel the dread in the ordinary arithmetic 3 regiments abreast, fewer than 200 runners between them, asked to cross a floor paved with mines and 88s, then wrestle with whatever panzer strength still had breath to counter. The night before dawn was all procedure. Sappers went forward again, shoulders against time, cutting twin corridors that would never be wide enough for comfort. The infantry stepped beside them, listing the same hazards they had been listing for a week: box mines, teller mines, booby traps where the enemy guessed the British might be getting clever. Behind, the armored brigade formed in a darkness that felt like custody. I have a regimental diary from one of those 3, and the entry is monastic tanks closed up, last maintenance, men briefed, letters collected. Somewhere a chaplain climbed a hull and talked about duty with the modesty that makes duty bearable. Somewhere a sergeant reorganized a troop on the tailboard of a truck. Men and machines swapped like cards by a dealer who knew that luck would be loud at dawn and he must do what could be done while luck still slept. Rommel, newly returned, read the British intention without the benefit of clairvoyance. He had seen this pattern in smaller forms. British artillery would scour, engineers would open, and the armor, once inside, would try to turn the gun line. He positioned what remained of 15th and 21st Panzer behind a belt of anti-tank guns and told the Italians who still had guns to hold down the hinges. Ammunition was counted like wedding silver. Fuel was the family heirloom that everyone touched with reverence because it could not be replaced. His diary admits no panic, only a thinning vocabulary we will hold. We must hold. We will counter where the British seem to breathe too deeply. The artillery announced the hour in that deep voice veterans call reassurance. It was not the random thunder of desperation, but the grammar of a plan: neutralize here, blind there, cut wire, push heavy weight on suspected batteries. I stood once on the rise where a British FOU adjusted that storm and learned how small adjustments own large consequences on a flat earth. At 05:45, the armored brigade moved. You can feel the lines stiffen on the page when the troopers shift from words to numbers. One regiment reported line crossed, another wrote through first tape. All of them wrote, soon after, about the world tightening to flashes. The charge, if that is what one must call it, looked nothing like cavalry to the men inside it. They went forward in 2 ranks, hulls touching dust, gunners scanning for the first unkind flicker. The German gun line answered with professional malice. 88s do not shout, they write. At 1,000 yards, the first turrets opened like fists unclenching under orders they had not given themselves. The radio traffic thickened with reports that sound like code to the untrained ear, and like blood to those who have seen the shorthand before sunray down, which means a commander is gone, brewing, which requires no loss. Runner, the last dignity of a machine that can still move, though all else is questionable. And yet, under that punishment, something moved that could not be persuaded back. 100 became 60, 60 became 30, but the 30 were over the crust, and behind them came fresher platoons that by the grace of those who had been spent could fight panzers instead of fixed guns. Tel El Akakir was not a hill to be seized, but a space to be made permissive. And for the first time in days, the map changed in honest ink. Everywhere in the file, the losses are counted with the care of a debt. Everywhere in the same file, the phrases gap enlarged and enemy armor engaged west of belts begin to appear with a frequency that history recognizes as hinge. In the melee beyond the guns, the desert remembered its early lessons. Troops fanned. Dust was used as a weapon. Hull-down scrapes were claimed like foxholes. German panzers, still dangerous, countered in knots. Each knot thrown like a punch meant to bruise the British appetite. Italians, Ariete survivors, and others whose names the lazy forget, laid their limited steel where it could hurt, buying minutes for mines that needed them. In this open world, the tank is at home precisely because the crew can see. A troop leader reading a turret silhouette at 2,000 meters and calling the right range is the desert's native son. I have gunner's notes, a tiny notebook with pencil stubs, where the day's corrections look like a music of numbers. Publish 150 on. Next. Craft under fire is the only antidote to legend when the sun is up. Around noon, the counterpunches began to lose their grammar. Axis formations that had once stepped off like parade squares now looked like question marks drawn in steel. Fuel went missing. Ammunition arrived in phrases rather than sentences. A German battery commander wrote with a schoolmaster's temper, "Do not move guns in daylight. You will be found." Then added in a smaller hand, "We moved them. We were found." Air came again, a heavy hand keeping heads down while British armor used its new ground not to sprint, but to lean, applying pressure like a memory that refuses to leave a room. In the north, Australians kept chewing, and by chewing kept a disproportionate slice of the Axis mind awake in the wrong place. Then came the order that was not a plan, but a refusal to admit maps. From far away, Hitler told Rommel to stand fast. It is a command invented by men who have never watched a brigade fail to refuel. Rommel obeyed in the way seasoned commanders obey absurdities with cosmetic compliance. He held where he could hold and moved where immobility would have meant suicide. Diaries from the evening of November 2nd show that peculiar fatigue that tells you a battle has moved from decision to sentence, both sides still writing, but only one with the authority to choose punctuation. The British set their commas and periods in roads and ridges. The Axis found its clauses clipped, its conjunctions missing. I walked the line of that armored brigade's survivors in an old photo, faces black with dust, eyes far away, tanks crookedly alive, many without their original crews. A troop leader wrote bluntly, "We did not break them. We made a hole large enough for others to choose where to break." It is not the sentence a propagandist wants. It is the sentence a professional salutes. When I align his words with the map, the truth fits without force. By evening, the British had ground to push through. The New Zealanders had a door they could hold open with bayonets and guns, and the Axis had fewer ways to answer questions that multiplied like flies. On the third day after supercharge, the collapse that looks sudden in film unspools slowly in paper. Orders to pull back 1,000 yards become 5,000. Reserve positions prepared in hope become shelters embraced in necessity. The British push did not gallop, it pressed. Recovery teams worked at the shoulder of the advance like tireless undertakers. Supply columns drew lines behind the leading squadrons, like veins behind a fist. A British brigadier wrote, "Keep your intervals. Do not chase." And in that plodding imperative, you can hear the rescue of an army's self-respect. Desert victories that last are not won in sprints. They are won by refusing to sprint when the ground finally encourages it. Even the enemy's nouns changed. Ariete, once a division, became the remnants of Ariete, Littorio, already tired, receded into sand in order of battle tables. Panzer numbers dropped below those that make maneuver doctrine sing. There were still claws, and several hard slashes landed on British brigades that grew overbold. But the handwriting of fate had turned from cursive to block capitals. In that big script, the desert wrote its first unmistakable answer to a question asked for 2 years. Can the 8th Army not only stop, but also break its opposite number in open country? It could, it had, but only because the tanks who called this arena home had accepted the house rules: mines first, lanes next, gunnery always, speed only when invited. Night brought a different kind of noise engines changing direction. Demolition charges. The melancholy thud of dumps burned rather than moved. British patrols picked up the music and reported it with the professional pity soldiers keep for foes who have worked as hard as they have. Messages flew, enemy withdrawing. Then the sentence that confirms not triumph but duty renewed exploit with caution. If there is romance here, it is the romance of men who learn to treat a desert like a partner, demanding, honest, and unforgiving to those who talk louder than they listen. The pursuit began not with a trumpet, but with a change in temperature. You can see it in the report's verbs tilting from assault and hold to advance. Overtake, harry. Along the coast road, burned dumps sighed with the sound of things that would not be carried. In the open south, tracks veered west in hurried chevrons. 8th Army stepped forward by orders that felt almost modest regiments to bounds. Brigades to phase lines, yet in aggregate those modest steps became the first true stride the British had taken in the desert since 1941. Tanks led because the desert allowed them to clear horizons, honest ground in long stretches, and an enemy now thirsty for distance. The rule book we had written with tape and guns turned into a map of routes. The Australians kept the hinge honest, pushing where stubbornness might have found a perch. The New Zealanders held doors and handed them open to armor. British brigades treated the Devil's Gardens like yesterday's exam, passed and done. In German records, the nouns began to shrink battle groups, shedding names for numbers, divisions dissolving into elements. Rommel's entries are economical and unsentimental, conserve fuel. Rear guards at named ridges, demolition where removal impossible. His army could still fight. It could no longer afford the war it had been waging. The desert does not forgive an unpaid bill, and Alamein had tallied in tons and hours. I stood one morning on the ruins near Fuka and read the day's papers in my head. Armored car patrols fanned like hounds, snuffing the edges of a retreat. Columns pressed the coast road, then sidestepped to avoid craters and mines left as farewell gifts. There is a false romance in pursuit. It rarely looks like a flowing ribbon. It looks like broken teeth being tongued by a tired mouth. Recovery wagons rattled. Fitters leaned from lorries with tools like priests dispensing absolution. Fuel bowsers shook their last tins and begged supply that had already spent tomorrow. Tanks kept the appointment because the desert made sickles of their sightlines. A glint on a far ridge, a puff of dust that was not wind, and a troop angling to cut it off. This is the desert's choreography when one side turns away. And yet, even in retreat, the Axis wrote hard sentences. I have a British brigade diary noting an armored counterstroke near Sidi Abdel Rahman, punch the lead regiment in the mouth, is the surviving colonel's unacademic line, followed by the sober record of 6 holes left smoking and a halt for an hour to find bearings and blood. Another file records a rearguard battery that made a wadi into a theorem, first shot long to measure British appetite. Second on, third deliberately wide to make the enemy believe deceit. Fourth true again. That battery died ugly but expensive. Pursuit, properly told, never forgets the price paid by the men who bought an army its next mile. At Mersa Matruh, the scale changed again. Not a battle, but a decision to deny a fight. The British came forward on a wide front, and Rommel's army slipped through the net with just enough cohesion to remain an army. Mines and charges taught caution. Caution taught patience. Patience lengthened life. In the south, where the Katara Depression had been the wall of the first act, the open flank now opened for real, but the British had learned not to sprint into the mirage. When armor was urged to exploit, orders paired the word with its chaperone with caution. A desert that had once rewarded dash now paid dividends to those who remembered lanes and arcs in the middle of hunger. I keep a set of photographs from the first week of November, black hulls, storks on pylons, the long, breathless distances that make North Africa a teacher of proportion. In their margins, clerks had written numbers that looked like numbers anywhere prisoners taken, vehicles counted, miles gained. But the faces in the frames tell another arithmetic, the narrow-eyed look of men who had hauled on a rope all morning and felt it finally give. 8th Army had not merely advanced, it had outlearned its enemy in this arena. Tanks could taste it in the way gunners spoke about range as if it were a friend, in the way sappers walked forward with lighter steps because the plan no longer asked them to improvise the impossible every hour. The line of retreat recited names the desert had heard before Matruh. Sidi Barani, the Halfaya Pass. Each sounded different now, not as prizes taken and lost in turn, but as stations on a westward sentence that had only one punctuation mark left. Tobruk, rescued in maps if not yet in vision. Benghazi shrugged at because it had changed owners too often to be a promise. El Agheila, the last natural door before a long hallway to Tunisia. The British did not catch a rabbit startled into a sprint. They herded a lion that chose to go because continuing the old fight would have fed it to the cage. It is important not to lie about that. The Axis withdrew by choice and by compulsion, and in that conjunction lies the meaning of Alamein. Losses sat heavy on both desks. British armored brigades were latticed with gaps, troops grown thin, squadrons relettered to hide fatigue. The returns do not crow, they know. Tanks in the desert are hardy beasts but sensitive machines, and the pursuit shook more to pieces than gunfire did. Final tallies, quarrelsome in every war. Settle near truce if you gather enough ledgers, substantial Axis armor, and guns gone. Allied numbers at last sustainable. Alamein did not end the enemy. It ended his economy. That is why Montgomery could be relentless without being reckless. He could push because his cupboards refilled faster than they emptied. The desert had finally worked for 8th Army as it had for Panzer Armee a year earlier. I spent an afternoon with a veteran of the 9th Armored Brigade, one of those thrown into the teeth on the morning of Supercharge. He showed me a photograph, 3 tanks in a line. One of them so shot it looked like a diagram of absence. "We were not lions," he said softly. "We were carpenters." He meant the angles and the measuring, the habit of cutting where the wood would take a nail and refusing to saw where grain would split. That is what it means to say the desert is home turf for tanks. It is not a promise of glory. It is a promise of legibility. In the open, a good crew can read and be read, can make a case at 1,000 yards and defend it at 2,000 more, can use dust as ink and ridges as lines. In the open, a plan can walk as fast as fuel will let it. But the same home punishes arrogance. Ghazala had taught that. Alam Halfa had reminded it. Alamein enforced it with proctors. Tanks that treat the desert like a parade ground vanish into bad sand and tidy mine rows. Armies that believe in speed without corridors find themselves writing letters of regret with wrecks. If I had to teach one lesson from these files, it would be the marriage that won the battle engineers who write lanes, gunners who hold arcs, staffs that count tins like psalms, and commanders who let impatience turn into violence only when the tape says the path is honest. Home turf is not a playground. It is a habitat with rules. When the pursuit finally slackened, not for lack of intention, but for the long reach of Tunisia, I stood again at El Alamain's ridge and listened to what the ground still had to say. The wind carried the same dry syllables it had carried before the first barrage. The Katra Depression lay to the south like an old argument no one could finish. The sea glittered with the indifferent seas perfect over centuries. Somewhere a train blew a whistle, late by a lifetime. I thought of the men who had walked these lanes and laid this tape, who had ridden steel into a crust of guns, who had leaned on a plan until the plan leaned back. Their labor answered the question in the title better than any lecture I could give. The desert is home turf for tanks, not because it flatters bravado, but because it amplifies craft. It rewards sight and punishes hurry. It lets steel speak its true dialect range. Angle, dust, fuel, and requires that other dialects be fluent beside it, the language of sappers and mechanics, of quartermasters and map readers, of pilots who lower their shadow to help a gunner breathe. After Alamein, the campaign's story moved on westward to passes and ports, northward to a rendezvous with an army crossing from Algeria. But El Alamein kept its rank in the memory of those who learned there what the desert loves. If there is romance, It hangs in the precise curve of a white tape under moonlight, in a gunner's whisper of a correction that lands true, in an engine that starts at dawn because a fitter sat awake to make certain it would. Call that hand-to-hand if you like. I will not argue. It is the closeness that matters men to their craft, plans to the ground, courage to restraint. The rest is noise that blew away with the smoke.